In the last section, we started working on our confirm component. So this is going to be a modal that's going to pop up right in front of the user's face. And we're specifically calling it confirm because we're going to set this thing up to ask the user a yes or no question. So let's continue working on this thing a little bit more. We've already imported a bunch of stuff at the top, so I think we're pretty good in that regard. Now we just need to toss on a whole bunch of markup in here, a whole bunch of JSX. So we definitely need to return some amount of stuff. There we go. First, we will place our modal. And the modal, the way that it works, here, before I start trying to be fancy in new line stuff, let's just put the modal by itself. So the modal itself takes some number of children components, and those child components that we pass into it are what are going to be displayed inside the modal. So you can think of this modal as a big wrapper, a big container. Anything we pass to it will be popped up and displayed to the user. So with that in mind, it makes it a little bit more obvious. We need to pass in the card sections, the button, the text, all that kind of good stuff need to be passed in as children to the modal. So I'm going to pass in here a view tag. We'll see why in just a second. Oops. And then inside the view tag, I'll place a card section. The card section will have a text tag. This text tag will be the area where we will specify some amount of text, something to ask the user an actual question. So that's the purpose of the text tag. Then beneath it, we're going to show our two buttons. So we need some text in here. I don't know what it's going to be just yet. I'll just leave it empty for right now. Then beneath this card section, I'm going to add another card section in. And this one will be for showing our buttons. I'm going to have two buttons because I want to ask the user specifically a yes or no question. So the first one will be like, yes, I want to do, or I want to accept whatever you're asking me. And the second one will just be hard-coded to be no. I don't want to do that. Whatever you're trying to ask me, I ain't buying it. So now we need to start thinking about the API for this component. This markup is just about all we need to get something on the screen, but what props do I expect to pass this thing? How functionally am I going to use this confirm component? Well, it's clear that we need to pass in some amount of text, something to prompt the user, ask them an actual question. I think that we'll use the same pattern we've used previously a little bit, where we passed in the text that we want to show as children. So remember, if I open up a set of JSX tags and then pass something in between them, it will show up inside of that target component as props.children. So in this case, I want to pass some text to confirm as a little child entry. So I will refer to it as simply children. That means we're going to need to receive the children property out of the props object that this will be called with. So that takes care of the text, the thing that we're actually the question we're going to ask the user. The next thing we need to think about is how do we actually deal with the user clicking yes or no? This one's not going to be too bad. So I think that a good idea here is going to be to say that whenever a button is pressed, maybe we will require our user to provide a on accept and on decline callback to this component. So we will assume that we will get a prop called on accept and on decline whenever we use the confirm. So if the user presses the yes button, we'll call on press. And pass it on accept. Notice that we don't have to do like this or bind or anything like that here. We just want to call the function. Also notice, very, very important, I am not immediately invoking it. By not passing or putting the parens there on the end, that means we are passing a reference to the function. We are not immediately invoking it. We're saying, hey, at some point in time, you might want to call this function. Just go ahead and take it. So then we've got the second on press. This will be our on decline. So again, we have now entered into a contract for the API of this component. We are expecting to pass in some text and also an on accept and on decline prop as well. All right. There's one thing more I want to do in here before we take a break. I want to add in some of those default properties that our modal expects. So remember, we just went over some of these inside the official documentation. So with stuff like animation type, transparent, all that kind of good stuff. So first we'll take care of the animation type. Chances are I always want to animate this thing wherever possible. I always want to animate stuff for my users. So I'm going to, by default, tell it slide. Slide just means slide up from the bottom of the screen. It'll give it a nice animation. The next prop we need to worry about is that on request close. So I don't really have, again, anything specific that I want to do when a user attempts to close this thing. I'm going to pass in a empty function just to satisfy the requirement of Android with the modal. Remember, like I mentioned, when we're on Android, we are required to pass in the prop on request close. So I'm just going to pass in empty function because I don't want to actually do anything. Next, we need to specify the prop of transparent. The transparent prop means, hey, do I want this thing to be like partially see-through? Yeah, I definitely do. I think that it leads to a fantastic user experience when they can kind of see the content behind the modal. So they can say, okay, I still like, things didn't just change and now I have no idea what's going on. If they can see the content behind the modal, it means that they understand that like, okay, I'm still in the process of trying to delete a user here. I know where I am, basically. Finally, and this is going to be the most critical one of all, we're going to pass in a visible flag. So the visible here, this is the real meat and potatoes of what's going on with the modal. Visible here is either going to be true or false. And I bet you could guess what it does. If we pass in visible of true, we want the modal to be displayed. If we pass in false, the modal will go away, it will be hidden. Now, the confirmed component itself cannot decide whether it needs to be visible, right? We only want to show this whenever a user taps on that delete button. So we are going to pass in a prop of visible. We will specify, we will tell this confirmed component whether or not it should be visible. Now, last thing I forgot to do, we designated the on accept and on decline. Those need to be passed in as props. So let's do that as well. All right, whew. That is a lot of typing. Unfortunately, we're still not quite done. Believe it or not, I know. I would love to be, but not quite yet. The last thing we're going to have to do, we're going to take a quick break before we do this. The modal by default has basically no styling to it. Like really nothing is going on there. So it's really up to us to place on some amount of styling to this thing to make sure that it looks nice when it's presented to the user. So the last thing we're going to have to do is toss on a whole bunch of default styling. We'll take care of that in the next section.